Okay, well, let's talk about the Confederates. They're not stupid. They know that Corinth is the likeliest objective for the Union Army because it's such an important transportation network. Um, and the commander of the Confederate Army at this point is a guy by the name of Albert Sidney Johnson. And Albert Sidney Johnson had had probably the best reputation as a fighter in the Confederate Army before the Civil War. He's a guy that was born in Kentucky. He actually spent some time in Texas, and he's buried in the. He's going to be killed at this battle, the Shiloh battle. Um, he's actually buried in Austin, and there's actually kind of a beautiful statue where he's buried by the very famous Austin sculptor Elizabeth Ney. So if you're ever in Austin and you're on the east side around East Sixth, and you go to this Texas State Cemetery, look up Albert Sidney Johnson's gravesite. And Johnson had had a really tough time when he was given command of the Confederate forces in the West. And I alluded to this briefly in, I think, my previous podcast, that although the Union Army has a big task in conquering this huge expanse of the West, you know, what we're talking about, Kentucky, Tennessee, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, and even Texas. Um, Conversely, it was very difficult for the Confederate military to defend the West because it was such a large space. And this once again speaks to how the rivers, the geography of the Western Theater, really favored the Union, especially once Grant captures the Tennessee River. It's very easy for him to send his army down the Tennessee River towards Corinth because he can just put them on naval transports and float them down there. So Johnson is having big problems in the West, and he suffers some defeats. And he decides that he's got to take kind of a gamble, a calculated risk. He's figured out by looking at the map, and any decent general would have figured this out, and Johnson was a decent general, that it was clear to him that the Union Army was going to move towards Corinth. And that the Union Army was going to try to capture that position. So what Albert Sidney Johnson decides to do, he decides to concentrate all the Confederates that he can uh, south of Grant's position at Pittsburgh Landing, aka Shiloh. And he's going to launch a surprise attack on Grant's position while they're waiting for General Buell. And just let me again repeat that Grant has sent his men to Pittsburgh Landing, and he's waiting for General Buell to come down from Nashville. And if you're looking at this map, it'll make a lot more sense. And at that point, there'll be an army of 75,000 men that they then can move on Corinth. And Albert Sidney Johnson knows that he can't beat an army of 75,000 men. So what he wants to do is he wants to go in and he wants to maul Grant's army before Buell can get there and force Grant's army into a retreat and maybe even destroy Grant's army. This is really what he was hoping. Albert Sidney Johnson was hoping that he could concentrate his forces in such a way that he could launch a surprise attack on Grant's army. It was sitting at the position at Pittsburgh Landing on the Tennessee River, and that he could destroy it. So he orders every Confederate soldier within his reach to come to Corinth. And the reason that he's able to pull this off is because, of course, Corinth is a railroad center. So all throughout the South, all available Confederates get on railroad cars, and they meet Albert Sidney Johnson in Corinth. And again, it kind of speaks to the importance of Corinth and the importance of transportation. And when all was said and done, Albert Sidney Johnson, by mid to late March 1862, had managed to gather an army of about 40,000 Confederates in Corinth, Mississippi. They weren't that well armed. They were pretty inexperienced. But the thing that Johnson had, Albert Sidney Johnson had, the great advantage that he had was that Grant had no idea whatsoever that Johnson was concentrating his forces at Corinth and was about to launch an attack on Grant's position just north of Corinth at Pittsburgh Landing. So Johnson is able to completely surprise Grant. And one of the reasons for this is that Grant is marching in enemy territory. And his information is a little bit sketchy. And what we know now is that as the Union Army became more experienced in fighting in the Western Theater, the Union Army and Union commanders began commonly going and capturing slaves and getting information from slaves. And then after January 1st, 1863, these slaves would become free. So more and more Union officers start relying on intelligence from slaves, who of course know the area. But this speaks to Grant's inexperience at this point. His men have not defended their position. They haven't dug up defensive trenches. They're just kind of on a little bit of a holiday. Grant himself has no idea that Albert Sidney Johnson is planning to launch an attack on his position with the hope, anyway, of absolutely annihilating Grant's army. So this was Albert Sidney Johnson's plan. He was going to concentrate as many Confederate soldiers in Corinth, Mississippi as he could, and then he was going to launch a surprise attack on Grant's position at Pittsburgh Landing, and then hopefully annihilate Grant's army and remove it as a factor in the Civil War. So he has to delay. It takes him a little bit more time to gather troops, Confederate troops. I mean, troops come from as far away as Florida to join Johnson's army. They come from Memphis, Alabama. He's just pulling troops from everywhere, and it takes him a little bit. It takes him a little bit more time to concentrate his forces. I'm talking about Johnson now. And the other thing is, once he gets them in Corinth, he has to organize them. At this point in the war, neither army is really that well organized. Neither army is that well officered. But by early 1862, like the first day of April 1862, Johnson hears that Buell is approaching Grant's army, and Johnson decides, okay, look, it's now or never. I've got to hit Grant hard now before he's reinforced with Buell's army, because once Buell gets there, then there's no way that my 40,000 men can take on an army of 75,000 men. It's just not possible. So he decides to attack on April 6th, 1862. And his officers beg Albert Sidney Johnson to wait. They don't think the army is ready. They don't think there are enough soldiers there, that the soldiers are not well enough trained. But Johnson says, look, it's either now or never. Buell was almost about to connect with Grant's army, and the whole point of Johnson's strategy was to annihilate Grant's army before it could concentrate with Buell's army. So Johnson says, I would fight them if they were 1,000,000, which is a very, very famous quote. I would fight them if they were 1,000,000. So on the morning of April 6th, 1862, Johnson told his fellow officers, tonight we will water our horses in the Tennessee River. The thought being that this surprise against Grant and Grant's troops would be successful, that they would be annihilated, and that the Confederate forces would water their horses on the Tennessee River because of the victory that they were going to gain against Grant's army.